Welcome to the astronomy segment of My Week at the Club, number 60. And this week I thought I'd do something a little different and tell you something that maybe it'd help you to win a bet in a bar if you hang out at the right kind of nerdy bars, I guess. And that's to pose a question to someone of, on average, what's the closest planet to the Earth? And I'll bet most of the time people would get that wrong, because they would probably say something like Venus. Venus, it gets as close as 26 million miles. Or they might say Mars. Mars gets within 34 million miles at its closest approach. Or they're probably unlikely to say Mercury. Whoops, wrong one. This Mercury. But it turns out that's the right answer. So Mercury was mentioned in an internet article here that I read within the last few weeks, is actually, on the average, closer than either Venus or Mars are, even though that at the closest, Mercury comes about 57 million miles from the Earth. And you may ask, well, what's the reason for that? Let me show you this plot. I did a little calculation on what the average distance is, assuming that the planetary orbits are all on a plane and they're all circular. What's the average distance to the various inner planets? And as you can see from this plot here, the average distance, well, to the sun is the least, but it's only 1 astronomical unit away. That's the distance from the Earth to the sun. And Mercury is just slightly more. It's maybe 1.05 astronomical units. Venus, on the other hand, gets out here at probably 1.15, so about 15% more than an astronomical unit. And by the time you're considering Mars, it's significantly farther. It's up around 1.8. And the reason for that is geometric. If you take a look at this slide that I prepared, you can see this is a little cartoon of the Earth and the Sun and a planet like Mercury or Venus. And if you look at Mercury where I've shown it, so that's sort of half of its orbit is closer than where it currently is, and half of its orbit is further away. So I'm keeping Earth fixed, and I'm letting Mercury go around the Sun inside of us. And you can see as Mercury goes around the Sun, half the time it's farther than the point that I've shown it. But the point that it's at there is actually is farther away than the Sun is. If you can see this little faint green line that I put in here, depicting the distance to the Sun, actually Mercury is a bit farther because it's the hypotenuse of that right triangle. And so on the average, it's more than half of its time in its orbit it spends further away from us than the Sun is. And it's less than half the time that it's closer to us. And you have this same sort of effect for the other planets too. The closer they get to the Sun, the less that geometric effect is. And that's what causes that sort of surprising answer that Mercury is actually, on average, the closest planet to the Earth. So, on to the chess. So, for the chess portion this week, I have a game that I played last night against Larry O'Rourke, down on 13th board after my loss last week. And it was a semi-Slav opening. And, it was a little bit of a happier occasion for me, as you'll see. So I opened with d4, and Larry responded d6, c4, d5. Okay, going into some sort of Queen's Gambit declined. That was fine with me. I played knight c3. And then he played a Slav Defense, a triangle system. And the idea here is that White has to start to worry about this pawn on c4 because, oops, not that pawn, this pawn on c4, because if Black were to capture it, and since I can't take back immediately, he would have time to support it with his b pawn. Now that can lead to interesting play, as I'll show you. I played knight f3, and at this point a possibility is the note boom variation, where black goes ahead and takes that pawn. I play e4, or I would play e4, threatening to recover it with my bishop, but of course he then defends the pawn, and I try to undermine it with my a pawn. So this is actually a pretty exciting variation coming out of this what appears to be a fairly stodgy opening. I mean, you know, if you look at it after c6 with this triangle, it looks like black is just shutting himself inside of a box, a triangular box, and black can certainly play that way, play it defensively, or they could play more aggressively. As it turns out in this game, it turned out more of a defensive setup. So after I played knight f3, Larry played g6, fianchettoing the bishop, or at least intending to. And I looked in the database, and out of the 25,000 or so Slavs that were in there, there was only one game that featured this move, and white won it. So it's not very popular. And I think the reason is because black is just, you know, putting all of his eggs into the light square basket here. And he's real strong on the light squares, but not so much the dark squares. And so I have real hopes of maneuvering around on the dark squares and possibly attacking his king, or at least getting an advanced outpost. So I played bishop to f4 to start that, to get my bishop outside of my pawn chain here and get it to where it can access easily some of these weak dark squares that he's made. He fianchettoed, and I went ahead and continued with a pawn move to continue my development. He played knight f6, who was very reasonable here. And I played h3, which is a little curious of a looking move, because, you know, I'm not kicking his knight away, I'm not keeping his bishop from pinning my knight or anything. But instead, the main point of this move is if he should play knight to h5, I want to be able to retreat my bishop back. Having trouble with my arrows today. We'll get rid of that one. I would play my bishop back into this little pocket on h2 so that it wouldn't get exchanged. Okay, he played a6, which I don't totally understand the point of. Possibly he was wanting to play b5, but it's easy for me to prevent that. Notice now that he's put all of his pawns on light squares. So with a4, I can keep that b5 move from being made, because his a pawn is not a defensive piece, because that rook on a8 is undefended. And so if he played pawn up, well, I'll just go ahead and show you. If he played pawn up in such a position, I could just go ahead and take it, and he can't take back, or I would take his rook. He would have to take this way, and, you know, now I could even take with my knight if I wanted to. I probably wouldn't because of the queen check, but you know, I could certainly take with a pawn. Would be a very reasonable move. So let's make that a bit more reasonable there. And he can't take back with his pawn. So of course he didn't do that. Instead, he just castled in this position. And I wanted to develop my bishop. You know, I wanted to get to the point where I could castle, and I wanted to develop my light squared bishop. And I had a choice really between e2 and d3. I've put it off about as long as I can. Usually in these positions you want to keep the bishop, if possible, not move the bishop until after an possible exchange of the d for the c pawns has been made, and then you can recapture. But of course that's not a possibility. And the reason I put my bishop on e2 was that I felt that the bishop was just a bit more exposed here in d3. Even though it's a little more active, at some point I felt that Larry might be able to get in e5, and if he was threatening then to play e4, forking my bishop and knight, if my bishop is here on d3, then when he plays e5, I'd be forced to do something immediately about it. I couldn't leave the tension, for example. So I wasn't too crazy about that idea. So that's why I played it to e2. He put his rook on e8, signaling that he probably wants to pushes e pawn to e5 at some point here. I castled to get my king off the same file as his rook. And he played his knight to d7. And now that the knight has committed itself to coming out through d7 instead of c6, instead of coming through this pathway here, I went ahead and exchanged off pawns because he wouldn't gain a lot by taking back with his c pawn. So in fact what he did was he took back with his e pawn, which is interesting because that gives us a so-called Carlsbad pawn structure where c and e pawns have been traded. And in this case I'm the one with the pawn minority here, over here on the queen side, the 2 pawns against 3. And that's often a strategic theme then, is to attack with those 2 pawns against the pawn majority over here. And as you'll see, I went ahead and did that immediately. This was probably an inaccuracy because this knight here on c3 is not defended at all. And there are various tactical ideas based on his bishop attacking my knight here, or the bishop coming through and attacking all the way to the rook once his knight moves. You know, for example, let's keep scrolling up here. For example, he could just play, oops, don't want to do that. Could just play an immediate knight to e4 in this position. And if I take him and he takes back, my knight has to move, say to d2. He could play here to b6 with a fairly even game. Also, it seems that he could play c5, looks to my eye like he can, because the point is that, after pawn takes pawn, he can just play knight takes pawn. And, well, actually, this loses 2 pieces for a rook. So maybe this isn't so good for him. If the bishop takes and then the queen takes, now he's really weakened himself on the dark squares. This would be horrible, actually, because the bishop's going to come out here to h6 shortly, and with the queen on this long diagonal, there's just too many threats against the king. So he couldn't do that. But playing the knight to b6 would have been fine in that variation. So that's based upon this weakness that I've created along the diagonal. So instead, after b4, Larry played b6, which is a flexible pawn move. So he's got his pawns abreast of one another, ready to respond differently depending on how I move. Okay. So at this point, I played my queen out to b3. I probably should have entertained the notion of playing an immediate b5 in this position. As I said before, he's weak along the a file, although if he initiates the pawn trade, if he took with the c pawn and I took back, then he can't take back because of the pin, which will lose the rook. But if he took with the a pawn first, then I could take back. And, I like this position reasonably well, but he could, this might be playable for black. I was a little worried in these positions that I might be promoting this pawn advance of c6 and opening up that, kind of forcing open this long dark diagonal on a1 to h8. So anyhow, I didn't push the pawn. Instead, I played queen b3 to support the pawn thrust to move later. But that gives him time to develop his bishop to b7. I then went ahead and pushed the a pawn forward. And now he has 2 moves, neither of which are particularly great. So the one he did not play was to capture my pawn with his pawn. Because I take back with my rook, and now this is just allowing me to build up pressure on this pawn on a6. I'm going to double rooks here shortly, and this bishop is attacking it. And he could defend it, but he also he gets tied down to the defense of it, and I have this weak square on c5 that I can maneuver my knight into by way of a4. Go there and to c5. So there's, a lot of nice play on the queen side here. I'd be very happy with any of that possibility. He didn't do that. Instead, after my a5, he pushed his pawn b5. And this, he had a third possibility too. He could have allowed me to play ab back here. But then he has that same problem with the weak a pawn, although it's not quite as bad as that other variation I showed you. So instead he pushed b5, and it stops my opening up of the queen side, at least momentarily, but it gives me quite a nice positional theme or way to play here. The position has some structure and some things that white can maneuver against. So I have this half-open file now, going up to his backward c pawn, which is a very obvious plus on white's part. This bishop he has on b7 is just a glorified pawn at this point, and is really not doing much for him at all. My rooks, I've completed my development basically. I can put my rooks on whatever files I want to put them on. This is a really nice position for white. And so I had to decide now whether or not I wanted to, where I wanted to play. I decided that maybe the best thing is just to go ahead and try to play along this weak c file. So I played my rook to c1. Okay. He made a move I didn't see coming, which was not a bad move. It made me think a bit, and that's bishop to f8. It seemed kind of unusual to do that with your fianchettoed bishop, but I think his idea is that his queen is likely to make an appearance on e7, at which point he then has the bishop and queen battery threatening my pawn on b4. Now, I do have I have two ways to defend it. I could come back with my knight. That doesn't appeal to me because I don't like my knight on a2. And I could also play my rook back to b1, which appeals to me a little bit more, although even that is not great. But he's had to put his pieces on some non-optimal squares in order to do this too, so it's a bit of a wash. So in this position, I had to decide where I wanted to, my one piece that hasn't gotten into the game at all yet here is my rook on f1. And the question is, where does it belong? It could go on e1, where it's going to help support, me playing e4 at some point. And also, if I really imagine that, I wanted to discourage his queen from coming through to e7. And one way to try to discourage that was to put my rook on e1, where it's would be facing his queen. d1 is a reasonable square because if I push e4, then this d pawn could become weak, and so a rook on d1 would make sense. And maybe even the rook on c1. If I am forced to play my other rook to b1, then I might want to have that rook on the half-open file. Or maybe I'll end up doubling rooks on the c file, on c1 and c2. So it was hard to figure, but ultimately I decided to put it on the e file to discourage him from putting his queen on e7. Okay, he developed his rook to the half-open file of mine to support that weak c pawn, which makes sense to me. I put my bishop on a bit more active square, where in particular it now supports the e4 square. Not only does it support the e4 square, but it got out of the way of this rook. So once my pawn goes forward, I'll have the knight, the bishop, and the rook all supporting the pawn there. So now I'm threatening to play e4. And because of that, he blockaded with his knight on e4. The only problem is that this fails tactically. And so this is the first of two mistakes that really just decide the course of the game. That's basically what it came down to. He would have been better off doing something like playing his queen to e7, forcing my rook over to defend my b pawn, and then maybe playing his queen back and saying, what am I going to do? I suppose I could play e4 at this point. But still, it's not as bad as what happened in the game. After knight to e4, I could take that knight with either my bishop or knight, but it's actually, I decided analyzing it that it was quite a bit stronger to do so with my bishop. Because when he takes back, I play knight to g5, and now I have two attacks on this pawn, so I'm threatening to win it. But at the same time, I have my knight and queen both attacking this weak square at f7. So I'm threatening to come in with the queen check, king goes to the corner, and queen takes h, come here, check, and then come over here, checkmate. So he has to do something about that. Very strong threat. And he really doesn't have many options at all. He could play the rook to e7, and that's very ugly because it would interfere with his queen and bishop, their mobility. So instead he plays queen to e7. But I foresaw this, and the problem with this move is that I just go ahead and take this pawn anyway, and now I'm threatening to come after his queen. And he actually realized, he saw the coming storm here and thought about his move for a long time. And I thought about his move for a long time, and we came to different conclusions. So h6, I thought that was a possibility, but getting a phone call, but I don't think I'll answer it. For reasons you'll see, that's not a good move. What I also realized, though, is that he did have quite a reasonable move in c5. And at first I was worried about this because I can't really follow through with my plan of bishop to d6 attacking the queen, because then he can just push the pawn attacking my queen. I could take his queen, he takes my queen. That didn't appeal to me. So if I move my queen, then he can just retreat his queen back, because now this, not that weak point, this weak point on f7 is no longer attacked twice, and so he doesn't need the queen to defend that square. And so he does that, and he's now threatening to actually win this knight on e4, and I have to do something about that. So it's, it looked like that was a good line for him, but of course what I realized is that I don't have to play bishop to d6. I mean, this is after he pushed, so okay. After if he were to push that pawn to c5, I don't have to play bishop to d6. Instead, I have a better move with just knight takes pawn. Okay, so that's a second pawn. And he trades the knights and chases my knight back, and then comes down to, form a battery going toward my king. But even so, this is 2.5 to 3 pawns advantage for white. And it should be enough to win the game. But it's a lot better than what happened in the game, because after h6, white's about 7 pawns ahead because of this bishop move. And now he's losing the queen, because wherever he goes with the queen, actually I should analyze that to make sure there wasn't some hidden resource I didn't see. Yep, no. Okay, so it's calling for either h takes g5 or queen takes g5. So what he did was play h takes g5, which is sort of what I thought he might do. And the problem being, if he retreated the queen to d8, then that checkmate would have happened. So he has to let me win the queen. I win it, and he recaptures my bishop. So the score is that now he's got 2 pieces for the queen, but I've got 7 pawns to 6. So it's a queen and a pawn for 2 bishops. So, that is clearly a winning advantage for white. White just has to figure out how to go ahead and do it. And there are multiple ways to win a game like this. One way would be to open the position up, say, by pushing my kingside pawns and use my queen, knight, and rooks to attack his king. That may be the strongest method, and I think that's what the computer calls for. But it's also a riskier method because he has 3 minor pieces and the 2 rooks. He actually has more pieces than I have. And it is fairly easy in a situation like this to suddenly find that you've allowed your queen to get trapped, or a skewer to happen, or a fork to happen with the knight. So instead I played basically a lower risk continuation. Maybe that's not quite as strong as going for an immediate checkmate with all my material, and that's just a trade down. So I played my knight to c5, where he's going to have to trade one of his pieces for it. He chooses to trade the knights. I take back, and now he tries to grab the only open file that there is, the d file, but I just oppose him on the d file. And I'm able to trade. He goes ahead to try to get that very poor light-squared bishop into the game, but I'm able to trade both pairs of rooks. He attacks my queen by a little Zwischenzug check. He takes back, and then my queen moves, and now it's just the queen against the 2 bishops. And I had to, before I went into this line, I was trading the rooks off, I had to convince myself that there wasn't some sort of fortress position that he could get into. So, the idea is that, well, maybe he could post his bishop somewhere where it's being guarded by the pawns and protecting the pawns, and that he could tuck his king in behind his other bishop, and that I wouldn't be able to capture anything or get in with just since I only have a queen. But I decided that he couldn't really do that because there's no place the white squared bishop can go where he can save these, where he can be protecting both of these weak light squared pawns over here on the queen side. And as soon as I win one of those, then it's a threat to promote, to push the rest of my pawn is threatening to promote by going all the way to the end of the board. It's if worst came to worst, I could always push my pawns and open up some possibilities on the king side to break open his fortress. But I figured even that wouldn't be necessary. So I traded off the rooks, attacked his bishop. Now he can go here, and he has, for the moment, closed off all of my entry squares for my queen, so I can't get in that way. But what I can do is simply go to e4. And now he's in a real bind. If he, I'm threatening to take this pawn on c6. There's no good way to defend it. If he came back with the bishop, I could come here, and now I'm winning one of these 2 bishops. They're skewered, neither one is defended. If he went here, which looks like a bit stronger of a move, because the bishop's defended as well as the pawn, that just allows me to get in back behind the pawn formation. So I could simply check, say the king comes up, and then the queen comes over, and now I'm going to win the a pawn, and with it the game, because this a pawn would promote. Now, in actuality, he played his king to h7. I think he overlooked that the c pawn was attacked, but it just makes things go a little faster. So I took it, and he came back. And to be honest, now the game enters a phase that's not very interesting. It's just mopping up with substantial material edge. So I'll just go through it very quickly. I went ahead and took his other pawn. Actually, here I expected him to come down after, after my b pawn, but he doesn't really have time to win it. So instead he played g4. I traded that off, and now I take the b pawn. Now I have all 3 connected passed pawns. It's absolutely hopeless. And he started shuffling his king around, I think hoping that he could set up a stalemate situation of some sort. But he has far too much material on the board, and plus, of course, for once I had time on my clock, and I was going to be careful that I didn't put him into stalemate. So I just went ahead and basically promoted a pawn by advancing my a pawn up the board. And he can't really stop it. I mean, he can try to stop it by bringing his bishop on this path. But as you'll see, I go to a7, and he tries to hold the square A8, but I can just interpose my other pawn. And he has nothing better than to take it, but I take it back, and now I'm going to get another queen. He moved his king, I got another queen. He pulled back, and now it's just a question of getting my queens close enough that I can actually checkmate without stalemating them. And now I'm threatening a checkmate on here on h8 with either queen. So he moves out, but I check him here, and this was kind of a cute little geometric motif because these two queens, you know, come across and guard all these squares. His bishop is blocking that square, so I'm threatening a checkmate. I'm actually not threatening a checkmate. Oh, he's in check. He's in check, so he only has one square to go to, and the square that he goes has to go, well, actually he resigned here. But if he went ahead and played to g7, okay, then I have, you know, either queen up would be a checkmate in that position. So that was it. It was a fairly easy game this week. I won't be making a game for the next 2 weeks. We're going to be off on a skin diving trip down to the island of Roatan off the Honduras coast. So I will see you again from the club 3 weeks from today or somewhere thereabouts. So meanwhile, have fun and keep enjoying pushing those pawns. Bye-bye.